In the summer of 1945, Japan was losing a war it refused to admit was lost. Cities were burning, not because of atomic bombs, that was still weeks away. They were burning because American B-29 bombers had been dropping incendiary explosives on Japanese cities for months. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. The government told people to stay calm, to work, to believe in victory. But the people could smell the smoke from hundreds of miles away, and they were not stupid. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was 29 years old. He was not a soldier. He was an engineer, a naval engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of the largest industrial companies in Japan. His job was technical, precise, demanding. He designed ships. He calculated weights, stress points, structural loads. He was the kind of man who trusted numbers over rumors, who believed that if you did your job correctly, things would hold together. He lived in Nagasaki with his wife Hisako and their infant son. Nagasaki was a port city on the southwestern coast of Kyushu Island. It had shipyards, factories, churches. It was one of the most historically unique cities in Japan, a place where for centuries Western traders and missionaries had come and gone. The people of Nagasaki had a reputation for being open, pragmatic, quietly resilient. Yamaguchi fit that description perfectly. He was not a dramatic man. People who knew him described him as focused, disciplined, somewhat reserved. He did not speak much about fear, even as the war deteriorated around him. He kept working. That was his response to the chaos of wartime Japan. Keep your head down. Do your job. Come home to your family. In the spring of 1945, Mitsubishi assigned him to a 3-month work rotation in Hiroshima. This was standard practice. Engineers traveled between company facilities depending on where projects demanded their expertise. Hiroshima was a major industrial and military hub, home to the Second Army headquarters, weapons depots, and factories running at maximum wartime capacity. The city had roughly 350,000 residents, and at any given moment it was also packed with soldiers, workers, and civilians who had been relocated from bombed areas elsewhere in the country. Yamaguchi arrived in Hiroshima and settled into his temporary accommodations. For 3 months he worked, ate, slept, and counted the days until he could return to Nagasaki. He missed his wife. He missed his son. He had seen the boy only briefly since the assignment began. By early August, his work in Hiroshima was nearly finished. His rotation was coming to an end. He was scheduled to leave on August 7th, one day after a date that would become permanently carved into human history. On the evening of August 5th, Yamaguchi packed most of his belongings. He was ready to go home. He had no reason to believe the next morning would be anything other than an ordinary Monday, hot, humid, and exhausting, the way every summer day in Hiroshima had been that year. Japan in August 1945 was a country running on nothing but momentum and denial. Food rationing had become severe. Families were surviving on sweet potato stems and dried soybeans. Men who had worked in factories their entire lives were being handed wooden rifles and told to prepare to defend their neighborhoods against an American land invasion that everyone privately believed was coming. Children were being evacuated from cities. Women were being organized into civil defense units. The government radio still broadcast messages about the unbreakable Japanese spirit, but the people listening to those broadcasts were exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. They were tired in their minds and in their souls. Yamaguchi understood this exhaustion personally. He had been away from home for 3 months, working in a city that felt increasingly tense and overstretched. He was not afraid exactly. He had made peace with the uncertainty the way most Japanese civilians had by that point. You simply stopped imagining the future too clearly. You focused on the task in front of you, because looking further ahead than that was too painful. The morning of August 6th started before sunrise for him. He had one final errand at the Mitsubishi facility before his departure the next day. He gathered his things, ate a small breakfast, and stepped outside into the thick summer heat. It was already warm at that hour, the kind of humid heat that presses against your skin and makes your clothes stick before you have walked even half a block. The sky above Hiroshima was clear, not a single cloud. Yamaguchi began walking toward the shipyard. The time was approximately 8 in the morning. In the air above Hiroshima, at an altitude of roughly 9,400 meters, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay was completing the final segment of its approach. Yamaguchi did not know this. Nobody on the streets of Hiroshima knew this. Some people had heard the distant drone of aircraft earlier and looked up briefly before going back to their morning routines. Air raid alerts had become so frequent that people had started ignoring them when the planes seemed to pass without incident. The sirens had cried wolf too many times. He was in an open area near the Mitsubishi shipyard, still walking, when he heard it, a sound he later described as unlike anything he had ever heard before. Not an explosion, not a roar. Something stranger, a compression in the air itself, as if the atmosphere had inhaled sharply. Then, the sky turned white. The white light lasted less than a second, but it was not like any light a human being is supposed to survive. At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy detonated approximately 600 meters above the center of Hiroshima. The temperature at the point of detonation reached several million degrees. In the first fraction of a second, a fireball expanded outward at a speed that made the concept of running meaningless. Within 1 mile of the hypocenter, nearly everything, wood, concrete, flesh, bone, was either vaporized or set instantly on fire. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was approximately 3 kilometers from the hypocenter when the bomb exploded. That distance is the only reason he lived. The thermal pulse hit him first, a wave of radiant heat traveling at the speed of light, intense enough to burn skin from a distance of 4 kilometers. Yamaguchi threw himself to the ground by instinct, a reflex his body made before his mind had processed what was happening. He pressed his face into the earth and covered his eyes. The shockwave arrived seconds later. It hit like the fist of something incomprehensible, a wall of compressed air moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, carrying glass, metal, wood, and pieces of buildings with it. The shockwave picked up objects and people and hurled them like they weighed nothing. It collapsed wooden structures instantly. It stripped bark from trees. It shattered every window within kilometers in a single instant. Yamaguchi was thrown from the ground. He could not tell which direction was up. The world had become noise and pressure and heat and darkness all at once, and for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. He had no idea whether he was alive or dead. Then, the noise stopped. What followed the explosion was one of the most disturbing things survivors described. A silence so complete, it felt wrong. The city had been full of sound one moment, and then suddenly, it was not. No birds, no voices, no traffic, nothing. Just a ringing in the ears and the distant crackle of things beginning to burn. Yamaguchi raised his head. He could not see Hiroshima anymore. Where the city had been, there was now a column of smoke and fire rising into the sky at a speed and scale that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one he had woken up in that morning. The cloud was enormous, twisting, boiling upward in a shape that no one had ever seen before, and that no one who saw it that day would ever forget. It was not gray smoke. It was not black smoke. It was a violent mixture of both, lit from within by fire, climbing higher and higher with the energy of something that had no intention of stopping. The heat was still radiating from the direction of the blast. Yamaguchi looked at his arms. The skin on the upper half of his body had been severely burned. On his left arm and parts of his face and neck, the skin had peeled away or was hanging in sheets. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing because there was no pain yet, not real pain. The nerve endings in severely burned skin are often destroyed along with the tissue, and so the body sometimes grants a brief, terrible mercy in the first minutes after a burn injury. The pain would come later. Right now there was only shock and a strange, clinical awareness of the damage. He got to his feet. Around him, the landscape had been transformed in a way that the human mind resists accepting. Buildings that had stood moments before were rubble. Trees were stripped bare or burning. The road he had been walking on was covered in debris and dust so thick that the air itself was nearly impossible to breathe. The light was wrong. The sky above was darkening rapidly from the debris cloud, turning the morning into a kind of false dusk. And then the people appeared. They were coming from the direction of the blast, moving in a slow, disorganized mass toward the outskirts of the city. But they did not look like people moving with purpose. They moved like something essential had been removed from them. Many were silent. Some were making sounds that Yamaguchi later struggled to describe, not quite screaming, not quite moaning, something between the two that carried a specific quality of complete disbelief. Their clothing had been burned or blown off. Their skin, in many cases, had been burned and was hanging from their arms, their faces, their hands. Some held their arms slightly away from their bodies, because allowing the burned skin to rest against anything at all was unbearable. These were people who had been further from the hypocenter than Yamaguchi. The people who had been closer were already dead. A child was sitting in the middle of the road, alone, making no sound, just sitting. Yamaguchi looked at the child for a moment and then looked away, because looking directly at certain things in those first hours required a psychological strength that no one had been prepared to develop. The black rain began roughly 20 to 30 minutes after the explosion. It fell as dark, oily droplets, a mixture of soot, ash, radioactive fallout, and moisture pulled up by the explosion and then returned to Earth. People who had survived the blast held out their hands and caught the rain without understanding what it was. Children opened their mouths to it. It stained clothes and skin black, and it carried a radiation dose that would not reveal its damage for weeks or months. Yamaguchi moved through the city in a state that he later described as a kind of walking unconsciousness. He knew he needed to find shelter. He knew he was injured. His ears were still ringing. His vision was affected. The pain in his burns had begun to arrive, slowly at first, and then with a steady, escalating intensity that made each movement a deliberate act of will. He found a damaged building and took shelter inside. Around him, fires were spreading across the city in multiple directions. Hiroshima had been built largely of wood, and the thermal pulse from the bomb had ignited thousands of individual fires simultaneously. Those fires were now merging into larger ones, and in certain areas of the city, they would combine into a firestorm, a self-sustaining wall of fire large enough to generate its own wind, pulling air inward toward the heat and feeding itself continuously. Approximately 70,000 people died in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Some estimates place the number higher. Many of them died not in the initial blast, but in the fires that followed, or in collapsed buildings, or from injuries sustained in the chaos. By the end of 1945, factoring in deaths from radiation sickness in the months that followed, the total death toll would rise to somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000 people. Yamaguchi did not know these numbers that day. He knew only what was immediately in front of him: the smoke, the heat, the injured people, the sounds of a city in the process of dying. He spent that night in a damaged air raid shelter with other survivors. The pain from his burns kept him awake. At some point during that night, lying in the dark with his injuries and the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, a thought became completely clear to him. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet and persistent understanding that settled into his mind like a stone dropping into still water. He needed to get home. He had a wife. He had a son. He had a life in Nagasaki, waiting for him 270 kilometers away. Whatever had just happened to Hiroshima, whatever this weapon was, whatever came next, he needed to be with his family. He decided he would leave as soon as it was light enough to move through the city. He had no way of knowing that going home would not save him from what was coming. Morning came slowly over a city that no longer functioned as a city. There were no schedules, no transport systems, no clear authorities giving orders that anyone could follow. Hiroshima had been cut apart in a single moment, and now the pieces were trying to move without any structure holding them together. Tsutomu Yamaguchi stepped out into what remained of the streets. The fires had not stopped during the night. Entire districts were still burning. The air was thick, heavy, difficult to breathe without coughing. Ash moved through the air like gray snow. The sky was dim, not because of clouds, but because of what had been lifted into it and had not yet settled back down. He was injured, but he could walk. That fact alone separated him from thousands of others. Every movement hurt. The burns on his upper body had worsened overnight. Blisters had formed. The exposed skin had begun to dry and crack. His bandages were improvised, strips of cloth, pieces of whatever material he or others could find. There was no real medical treatment available. Hospitals had been destroyed or overwhelmed beyond function. Doctors and nurses were either dead, injured, or trying to manage hundreds of patients at once with no supplies. Yamaguchi did not wait for help. He moved toward the railway station. That decision was not obvious. Many people were not trying to leave the city at all. Some were searching for family members. Some were too injured to move. Some simply did not understand where they could go or what away even meant after something like this. But Yamaguchi had one clear direction in his mind: Nagasaki. The journey should have taken a matter of hours under normal conditions. Nothing about this journey was normal. The railway infrastructure had been damaged, but not completely destroyed. Some lines were still operating in a limited, chaotic way. Trains were not running on schedule. They arrived without warning, overloaded with survivors, and left as soon as there was even a small possibility of movement. When Yamaguchi reached the station, he found what remained of order. People were everywhere, injured, burned, disoriented. Some lying on the ground, some sitting in silence, some calling names that no one answered. The station staff, those who were still able to work, were trying to coordinate departures, but the situation had already moved beyond control. When a train finally arrived, it was already full. People pushed anyway, not aggressively, not violently, but with a kind of quiet desperation. There was an understanding that space did not matter anymore in the usual sense. If there was room to stand, to lean, to exist inside the train, that was enough. Yamaguchi got on. Inside the train, there was almost no conversation. The people there did not need to explain what had happened. They carried it on their bodies: burned skin, torn clothing, empty expressions. Some stared forward without blinking. Some leaned against walls or each other, too exhausted to hold themselves upright without support. The train moved. Slowly. It stopped often. Sometimes because of damaged tracks. Sometimes because the line ahead was blocked. Sometimes for reasons no one inside the train could see or understand. Each stop stretched time. Each delay made the journey feel longer than it already was. At some point during the trip, the pain in Yamaguchi's body became constant. There was no longer a distinction between movement and rest. Everything hurt. Standing hurt. Sitting hurt. Breathing hurt. The burns had fully awakened. The earlier numbness was gone, replaced by a deep, persistent pain that did not spike or fade. It simply stayed. He did not lose consciousness. He stayed present through the entire journey, holding on to one idea with absolute focus: reach Nagasaki. The train carried him out of Hiroshima, out of the destroyed zone, out of the immediate aftermath of something that very few people in human history had ever experienced. But what he carried with him did not stay behind. He carried the image of the light. He carried the silence that followed. He carried the faces of the people moving through the ruins without understanding why they were still alive. By the time he reached Nagasaki on August 8th, his body was damaged, his hearing was partially impaired, and his entire understanding of reality had shifted in a way he could not yet fully process. But he was home. Nagasaki was intact. The buildings were standing. The streets were functioning. People were moving with purpose. There were no fires covering entire districts, no blackened sky, no mass silence. It felt unreal. Yamaguchi made his way to his house. His wife saw him and did not recognize him immediately. His appearance had changed too much in too short a time. His burns, his bandages, the way he moved. It took a moment for her to understand that the man standing in front of her was her husband. When she did, the reaction was immediate. Shock, relief, fear. He was alive, but not unhurt, not unchanged. That night, he told her what had happened in Hiroshima. He described the light. He described the destruction. He described a single bomb that had destroyed an entire city. It sounded impossible, not exaggerated, not unlikely. Impossible. Even for someone standing in front of him, seeing his injuries, hearing his voice, the scale of what he was describing did not fit into any known understanding of warfare. The next morning, August 9th, Yamaguchi went to work. He reported to the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki. His body was injured. His bandages were visible. His condition alone was enough to raise questions. His supervisor looked at him and asked what had happened. Yamaguchi answered clearly. He said that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. Not multiple air raids. Not conventional bombing. One bomb. His supervisor did not accept that explanation. He interrupted him. He told him it was impossible. No single bomb could destroy an entire city. Yamaguchi tried to explain again. He described the flash. He described the heat. He described the shockwave. He described the cloud rising into the sky. He was in the middle of explaining it for the second time when the light appeared again. The second flash was not identical, but it was close enough that his body recognized it before his mind did. At 11:02 in the morning on August 9th, 1945, a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man detonated above Nagasaki. It exploded at an altitude of approximately 500 meters, with a force even greater than the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. Yamaguchi saw the light through the window of the office. For a fraction of a second, everything stopped. Not outside, inside him. There was no confusion this time. No attempt to understand what was happening. His body reacted instantly, driven by memory that was only 3 days old and already burned into him at the deepest level. He dropped to the ground. He covered his head. He braced. The explosion followed. The shockwave tore through the building with violent precision. Windows shattered inward. Glass became shrapnel. Walls cracked. The structure groaned under the pressure as if it might collapse at any moment. But it did not collapse. The office building was reinforced concrete. Unlike much of Hiroshima, parts of Nagasaki had structures capable of absorbing and redistributing some of the force. That difference, measured in materials and design, was the difference between instant death and survival for many people inside. Yamaguchi felt the building shake, but he was not thrown the way he had been in Hiroshima. The violence was still there. The force was still overwhelming. But this time, there was something else layered on top of it. Recognition. He knew what came next. The silence, the dust, the people, the realization. He did not need to look outside to understand that the city had just been destroyed. But he looked anyway. The sky over Nagasaki was already changing. A massive column of smoke and fire was rising in the distance, expanding upward with the same unnatural speed, forming the same towering shape he had seen before. It was not imagination. It was not confusion. It was the same phenomenon, repeated in a different place, on a different day, with the same outcome. The impossible had just happened twice. Inside the building, people were shouting. Not in panic at first, but in confusion. What was that? What just happened? Some assumed it was a large conventional explosion. Others thought it might be a direct hit from a high-yield bomb. No one around him immediately said the word that Yamaguchi was already thinking, because 3 days earlier, that word had not existed in any practical sense. Now it did, and he was the only person in that room who fully understood what it meant. He tried to speak. He tried to tell them. But the situation was already moving beyond explanation. Outside, the destruction was unfolding. Nagasaki's geography made the blast different from Hiroshima. The city was built in valleys, surrounded by hills. The terrain partially contained the explosion. limiting its spread in some directions while intensifying it in others. Entire districts were still annihilated. Tens of thousands of people were killed instantly. Fires began to spread. Buildings collapsed. The same patterns repeated, shaped differently by the land, but driven by the same force. Yamaguchi remained on the floor for several seconds after the shockwave passed. Not because he was physically unable to stand, because standing meant fully accepting what had just happened. He pushed himself up. His body was already injured from Hiroshima. The second explosion did not leave him untouched, but compared to what he had already survived, the additional physical damage was limited. Cuts, shock, worsening of existing burns. His hearing, already damaged, deteriorated further. But the real impact was not physical. It was psychological. 3 days earlier, he had experienced something that should not have been survivable. Now it had happened again. In his home city. In the place he had believed was safe, simply because it had not yet been destroyed. That assumption was gone. Completely. There was no safe place. No pattern to rely on. No logic that guaranteed survival. Only chance. He left the office. The streets of Nagasaki were beginning to change the same way Hiroshima had. People moving without direction. Injured bodies appearing from the center of the blast zone. Smoke rising, fires starting. The early stage of a city collapsing into chaos. He moved toward his home. This time, the urgency was sharper. His wife, his son. He had left them just hours earlier. He did not know if they were alive. Every step toward his house carried the same thought repeating in his mind, over and over, with no variation and no relief. Not again. When he reached the area where his house stood, he saw that parts of it had been damaged, but not completely destroyed. He called out. His wife answered. She was alive. His son was alive. They had survived the second explosion. For a moment, inside a world that had just proven how fragile everything was, that fact stood alone. 3 days, 2 atomic bombs. And somehow, he was still standing in front of his family. There was no explanation that made sense. No framework that could contain what had just happened. Only a reality that had shifted so far beyond normal experience that even those living inside it struggled to believe it was real. Yamaguchi did not try to explain it anymore. He had already explained it once, and the world had repeated it anyway. Surviving the explosion was only the beginning. The real damage did not end on August 9th. It continued quietly inside the body. In the days after the bombing, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's condition worsened. The burns from Hiroshima had already pushed his body to its limits. Now, something new began to appear. Symptoms that did not behave like normal injuries. Fever, weakness, nausea. His hair began to fall out. At first it came out in small amounts, then in larger clumps. Each time he touched his head, more of it came loose. His skin, already damaged, became more fragile. His energy disappeared. Even simple movements required effort. This was radiation sickness. At the time, very few people understood what that meant. There was no clear treatment, no established method to stop it. Doctors could observe the symptoms, but they could not reverse the process. The body had been exposed to something invisible, something that continued to affect cells long after the explosion itself had ended. For many survivors, this was the stage where survival ended. People who had walked away from the blast began to die days or weeks later. Yamaguchi did not die. He came close. There were periods where he was unable to stand, periods where he could barely speak. His wife cared for him while also caring for their child, in a city that had just been partially destroyed and was struggling to provide even the most basic necessities. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were nearly non-existent. Information was limited and often unreliable. And still, life continued. On August 15, 1945, 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. For the first time, the Japanese people heard his voice. He announced that Japan would surrender. The war was over. For millions of people, that announcement brought a complicated mix of relief and uncertainty. For Yamaguchi, lying in a weakened state, the meaning was simpler. The destruction had stopped, but what remained did not feel like peace. Recovery was slow, painfully slow. His body gradually stabilized. The fever reduced. The hair loss stopped. The burns began to heal, leaving permanent scars. His hearing never fully returned to normal. The damage was not temporary. It became part of his life. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. Cities were reconstructed. Infrastructure returned. Daily routines reappeared. The visible signs of destruction faded faster than the invisible ones. Yamaguchi returned to work at Mitsubishi. He continued his career as an engineer. From the outside, his life began to resemble something normal again. But the experience did not disappear. He had seen 2 cities destroyed in the same way, within 3 days. He had felt the same force twice. He had watched people die in numbers too large to fully process. That does not leave a person unchanged. For a long time, he did not speak publicly about it. Not because he forgot, because there were no words that felt sufficient, and because many survivors carried a quiet understanding that explaining it would not make others truly understand. Decades later, he began to talk. Carefully, not dramatically. He described what he had seen, what he had felt, what it meant to survive something that most people could not imagine, and to carry that memory through an entire lifetime. In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized Tsutomu Yamaguchi as a survivor of both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings. 1 person, 2 nuclear explosions. The only documented case of its kind. By that point, he was in his 90s. An old man who had once stood in 2 cities as they were erased. He did not present himself as extraordinary. He did not describe himself as lucky. He spoke as someone who had witnessed something that should never be repeated. Tsutomu Yamaguchi died on January 4, 2010. He was 93 years old. He survived the only 2 atomic bombings in human history. But survival did not mean escape. Because some events do not end when the explosion fades. They continue, in memory, in the body, in the silence that follows.